So in this video and in the next couple videos, we'll be looking at developing the leather material. So go ahead and create a new graph within your package, or create a whole other package if you want. And let's start off this material by defining our base shape. And now this one's going to be a little bit different because we aren't going to be creating one kind of standalone shape itself and then tiling that, but instead we're going to be creating the entire kind of tiled material or tiled pattern using one particular node. And that node is going to be the cells 1 node. So I'll go and start to type in cells, and you can see we have a couple of those here, but I'm going to use the first one. Let's just go and plug that into our normal, AO, and height again, and then we'll just get rid of these guys. Now I do want to do a little bit of a kind of premature output setup here, because a lot of the read for this particular material is actually going to be done in 3D, whereas previously we've kind of used just the 2D view to start defining the pattern. So I first want to go ahead and set our normal intensity to be a little bit higher than 1. Well, a little bit higher. It's actually going to be quite a bit higher. And I'm going to set it to around 10. And we can see that'll really affect the normals of the surface here and really the surface read. I'm also going to come back down to our ambient occlusion. And again, we're going to need to use an AO node. And I'm going to want to make the height depth of this 0.03. So again, something very, very small like we'd seen for the previous materials. So really that's all I'm going to need to do there. And now let's take a look at iterating on this guy. So I didn't really get to talk about what the cells 1 node was, but basically it's going to be just a bunch of different kind of spherical segmentations, and really it's going to be a bunch of cells. And we'll see with the instance parameters that we can change the scale of this, right, to have more or less. And we can change the disorder. Now, because cells is a procedurally generated type of node, we'll have the ability to change what is called the disorder. And this disorder really just allows you to get some variation without having to change any of the scale or the rotation. And it's a very good slider to use for things such as procedural noises and procedural grunges. But beyond that, there really isn't a lot to this particular node. So the scale I want to use for this is going to be 50. So we can see that's pretty tiny, right? And we can use really whatever disorder we want. Now I'm just going to bring this down to 0.3. But again, it doesn't really matter. This is just to give us some variation. Now the next node I want to use is really what's going to define the look of the surface for this material. And that's going to be a high pass grayscale. So we can see once I plug this in, it's kind of made things a little bit darker overall. And I want to get a good angle of our 3D view here just to kind of see what's going on. Because as I bring this radius down, it's going to kind of flatten out this pattern. And we can see it's kind of starting to look a little bit like leather, right? Now, the higher we bring this up, the more it's going to look as it did when we first plugged it in. So that's kind of how the high pass is working, is it's just going to kind of clamp values to try and help flatten out what we have going on. So for the radius, what I'm going to use is a value of 0.35, which is actually going to be very, very non-contrasted or decontrasted. And it's going to look kind of flat in our 3D view here. But that's kind of the look we want, right? It's going to start to look a little bit more leathery. And now, even though it looks a little bit nicer, a little bit more leathery, there's a couple steps in between the cells and the high pass that I want to do to try and make this a little bit more organic. So let's go and bring the cells 1 back. And I want to do a couple of calculations in between these two nodes. And again, Power of Substance Designer, procedural nodes, yada, yada, yada. I think I've probably spoken about that enough for you. So the first thing I want to do here is to kind of add a little bit of variation to the larger surfaces or the larger cells of this pattern here. Because we can see some of them are kind of split up, like this one here, and maybe like this one here. But I want to add some very subtle variation in some other lines kind of cutting through at nondescript directions for these larger cells. So let's go and add a transformation 2D node, which we're familiar with. And I'm simply going to go ahead and divide by 2. So that's going to crush it in and make it a smaller scale detail. So now we can go ahead and add a blend node here on our primary chain. And let's go and plug this in. And let's go and change the blending mode to be multiply. So again, keeping the white values, or sorry, getting rid of the white values and just keeping some of those sharper lines there. So we can see what it's going to do is just kind of cut through exactly like that. Now it's a little bit too strong of an opacity. So let's go and bring this down to around 0.15 so that I still know what my primary shapes are, but we've kind of sectioned off and cut through with a little bit of a secondary pattern that's overlaid. So that's starting to look good, but I also want to kind of break up the straightness of each one of the lines in between these cells because again, it's still looking pretty man-made. So how we're going to do that is by using a directional warp node like we've seen. And again, I'll be using a Gaussian noise as our intensity output, or input I should say. So for the Gaussian noise, I'm going to want to use a scale that's a little bit higher, a little bit more intense. So let's go and take a look at using 75. And we can see that's going to drastically affect our pattern. So let's go ahead and drastically reduce the intensity that it's providing. And I think about 2 was pretty good for our intensity here. And so if we go ahead and just compare this, right? This is what we had before, and this is what we have now. We can also go and change the warp angle if we want, just to kind of randomize it a little bit more. And you can make this as intense as you want, and even go ahead and add another directional warp with an even smaller Gaussian if you want to get a little bit finer detail. Now let's take a look at a kind of cool but not necessarily vital part of our material, which is going to be the idea of microsurface wrinkles. Because when we apply this to a model, which we'll see in the modeling portion with Jeremy, it's going to look fantastic with larger folds and creases that we just get for free with the actual model itself. However, a lot of that microsurface details, such as those smaller wrinkles, we're going to have to access in the material itself. So to do that, let's first go ahead and prep our high pass here because the grayscale value, if we take a look by clicking this little eye, is going to be a little bit darker. And so the value is around 50%. And I think that's going to be a little bit too dark. So let's go and first add a histogram range node. And here's yet another histogram node we can add to our library of useful nodes. But we're not going to be using it exactly for the range aspect. And we'll just quickly take a look at what this does. As we can see, I've input our very bright image here. And the range slider is going to allow us to pretty much define the range or the cap on both ends. So it can be a little bit more contrasted or a little bit decontrasted. But we can also change the position value, either up or down uniformly. And that's the exact reason why I want to use this particular node. So I'm going to set the range to be 1 so that we're using the full grayscale range that we've plugged in. But instead, I just want to kind of position the entire thing uniformly to be a bit of a brighter value across the board. And so let's set the position to around 0.65, which really isn't going to change anything in our 3D view here, but it is going to change the grayscale pixel values. And this is going to set us up perfectly for applying wrinkles because now we have a little bit more space to indent or decrease values in this image. So how do we go about creating these creases or these wrinkles? Well, oftentimes when I think about something I want to do in Designer, I'll just go ahead and start typing in the word for that particular thing. And in this case, we want to look for creases, right? Well, it just so happens that there is a creased node, which we can go ahead and use. And if I zoom out here and take a look at what this is, it's going to be relatively similar to the effect that we're going to want to have. So first things first, let's get this on our material, and then we can take a look at iterating upon it. So we'll add this into the top socket of our blend. And let's see what we're working with here. So that's looking pretty cool, but not exactly what we want yet. So let's see what parameters we have for Creased. Well, we're going to be able to play around with the scale. We can again play around with the disorder to get just a bit of a different look. And finally, we can play around with the warp intensity. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this warp intensity use case is. I find myself whenever I use this node to just basically take this down to 0, which is going to be the same for this particular case. I'm also going to leave the scale at 1 because it's a good size in relation to the size of the leather pattern that we have going into it. And I'm also going to just kind of drag this disorder up because as we can see by default, it's got a very dark area and I don't really want to have any area that's too dark or too different from what the average is. So let's just try and get rid of that. Oh, but I'm selecting the wrong slider there so that we can kind of get something a little bit better averaged out. So now how do we blend this onto our leather? So let's take a look at our blend mode. And the mode I'm going to use is going to be overlay, so that it's going to kind of brighten and darken areas of our bottom pattern based on the brighter and darker values of our top input. Now that's starting to look pretty cool. And again, it's going to look kind of hopefully like creased leather here, but it's a little bit too powerful. So let's go and drop the opacity of this down to around 0.5. And that's going to look a lot better. Finally, there are 2 more nodes that I want to add on top of our creased here, which is going to give us more control over the intensity of the creases, as well as kind of the soft gradual blend into our leather pattern. So that's going to be the histogram range yet again, as we have just seen. And we're also going to be using a blur high quality grayscale, which we've also seen. So let's set our blur to be a quality of 1 and an intensity of 4, so that it's going to be some very, very soft creases that we're going to be getting across the surface of our leather here. And so why did I go ahead and add a histogram range, right? Well, if I kind of capture the light in a good spot here, what we're going to be able to do in the parameters video for this particular material is actually go ahead and expose this range slider to be the intensity of our leather. And so this is going to be really handy if we want to go ahead and have kind of a larger or more intense wrinkle or a little bit of a less intense wrinkle. So for now, I'm going to leave that at 0.5 for both, but just kind of put this in the back of your mind that we're going to be coming back to this and exposing it for further use. So really that's going to conclude the pattern for our leather material. And in the next 2 videos, we'll be looking at covering the final outputs and a couple more parameters that we can take a look at, which are going to add a little bit of fun and flexibility to this particular material. So in this video, we'll take a look at completing the final outputs for this material. As well, let's get a little bit more intricate with the outputs and the detail that we're going to be providing them. So I want to start with our normal map here. And what I want to do is actually add a little bit more surface information into the normal map itself without going ahead and also having to add that to our height map. So not all surface information has to be both in height and normal, and you can kind of decide which map you want to place it in. And the reason I want to do this is the information I'm going to provide it is going to be rather minuscule or incredibly micro compared to a lot of this, regular surface information that we have so far. And so oftentimes information that's really small on your material, you maybe don't want to go ahead and add that into your height if you're using the height for any kind of displacement. And so that would be a good scenario where you can go and just place it in your normal map. So how do we do that? And what are we going to be placing, right? Well, I want to pretty much take the patterns that we've already created, make it a little bit smaller, and then just kind of overlay that on top of our material so far. So I'll go ahead and add a cells 1 node again. And let's go and quickly use a high pass grayscale as well. So for the pattern size here, what I want to do is switch our cells 1 node to be about a scale of 70, right? So it's going to be much smaller than what we have currently. And let's go ahead and change the radius to be 1 so that we're going to get that kind of flatter leather pattern like we had seen before. So very easily, this is going to be the new information that I'm going to add to my normal map. But how do I go ahead and do that, right? Now, Designer gives us a lot of different options that we can go and combine normal map information. Because if we go ahead and take a look, right, starting to type in normal, you can see we have a lot of nodes that are going to handle normals for us. Now, the easiest way that we can go from combining a normal map with a grayscale image is likely going to be this height normal blender node. And so I'll select that, and we can see it's going to accept a normal map and a height map, which perfectly lines up to what we have now. So I'll go and plug this into our normal, and I'll plug this into our height. And let's just reroute this into our output. And we'll notice that nothing's happened. And that's because if we take a look at the parameters, we actually need to give an intensity to this node. And the intensity is basically going to be what is the intensity of this blend over top of our normal map. And so I'm going to use an intensity of about 0.5, just because we can see as I accidentally clicked a little too high, 2 is going to be pretty intense. So let's do 0.5. And it's just going to be a very, very subtle effect, right? We can kind of see some extra surface information that's going to just kind of cut through some of these cells themselves. And now the next output we can take a look at is going to be our base color. So again, like we've seen, we're going to want to start with basic blockout colors to help define what this is going to look like, and then we can start to iterate from there. So I'll go and drag out this uniform color just a little bit, and I want to make this a bit of a darker black color. So with this uniform color here, let's go ahead and just bring this down to about, let's do 0.1, right? Because that's going to give us a really dark black color. And our leather is going to start to look black. Now I want to add one particular node, which is going to kind of help us out here. So I'll drag this out and start to type in validate. And I'm going to want to use this PBR base color metallic validate node. And so we can see that it's going to plug in our base color right into the base color socket. And we're going to get this kind of like yellowishy off green color. And so what is this node doing for us? Well, we're not going to be using it in the actual material itself, but it's going to help pretty much validate and verify for us the colors that we're actually using in our base color and whether they are PBR friendly. Now, if you're not familiar with the term PBR or physically based rendering, the idea is that it's a workflow or a pipeline which we're using to try and get physically accurate results for our materials. And so it's a rendering system that we can use in 3D, which is actually how we're able to visualize our maps in this 3D space. And so we can see that if I drop this uniform color down even further, right, we're actually going to start to work towards red. And so this is kind of a red is bad, green is good system with this particular node, because we're going to want to stay within a value, right, value for our color of a particular range. And I'll put that range up on the screen now. So really what I'm trying to get at here with this is that even though we want our leather to be a black material, we don't actually want to give it a value of pure black or an incredibly dark color. So instead, I'm going to just start to drag my value up until we get to an area that is pretty much bright green. And I think around 0.12 is going to be pretty good. So this is going to just help us keep within a reasonable range for our actual colors that we're outputting, which are going to be PBR viable. So I want to go ahead and I want to take our uniform color and let's just hit Control D to duplicate it. Because now I want to start using this color to influence kind of like some rough leather wear and tear around the edges, like this is kind of chipping just a little bit. And I'm just going to go and change it to a pretty ridiculous color for now. So let's just do red. And let's go ahead and blend this together. And so the reason I'm using this ridiculous color is, one, it's very visible as we can see, but it's going to help us kind of isolate and see on our actual mesh or material where we're going to be defining these pieces, because we're going to be making a mask now and we're going to be driving that from our surface information so far. So let's come back down to our normal. And again, right, because our normal map is really where we get a lot of this surface information, I'm going to be using this particular map. Now we have two different places where we could draw this information from, right? we've got our initial normal map, which we're drawing from the height, or we've got this kind of extra blended on one, which is adding just a couple of different cells noise on top of our pattern. So it's going to be up to you where you want to draw this information from. But I think because this information is so minuscule or micro, I'm going to really just want to have this information showing up along the kind of edges of the larger, more prevalent shapes in our pattern. So I'm going to just stick with our initial normal map here. So from our normal map, I'm going to just drag off our connection and start to type in curvature. And we've seen this in previous videos with the curvature smooth, but I want to go ahead and actually use a different curvature map. So we have access to just a typical standard curvature map node, or we can use a curvature Sobel. Now I'm going to go ahead and use this second option here just because I find the lines are a little bit thicker and crisper using this node. And that's going to help us really identify those edges for our leather. So let's go and bring this up to our color information here. Maybe I'll bring this up a little bit more. And if we can recall about masks, right, is that areas that are black are going to only show the bottom input, and areas that are pure white are only going to show the top. So areas that are in between that black or 0 value and white or 1 value are going to show kind of a blend of opacity for both of those inputs. And for this particular mask, again, I'm not really going to want to have this weird awkward blend, but rather a pretty binary black or white mask. And fortunately, we actually have access to a node in Substance Designer, which is very specific to leather as well. So with this curvature node, I'm going to drag that out and start to type in leather. And we can see that we're going to get this leather wear node. So I'll plug that in. And we can see it's going to take an additional argument of the ambient occlusion. And now we can also provide this a mask if we didn't want to, create a mask for each one of these cells, but we're just going to ignore that because we want this across our entire material. So let's go and take our ambient occlusion as well into the mix here. And now with this node, I'm going to have the ability to start creating and reworking a pretty cool leather mask. But first, let's go ahead and plug this in so that we can see what's going on. So now we can see that based off of the areas that are white in this mask, it's going to take whatever the top value is, in this case, this disgusting red color, right? So we can see it a little bit easier. And any areas that are black are going to be our darker color or our bottom socket. So now let's rework this a little bit because I think the wear is a little too much. So let's go ahead and first change our curvature weight from 0.25 to around 0.55. So it's really going to draw on our curvature map here to identify these regions. I'm also going to bring our wear level down to around 0.45 so that we're not getting as intense values. Let's change the contrast up a little bit. If we take a look here to 0.55, right, kind of get rid of that middle area a little bit and just kind of take a look at only the larger edges. And I'm also going to bring our ambient occlusion masking up to around 0.9 so that we're going to get rid of kind of any of the values in the actual cracks themselves, because realistically they'd be kind of safe from any wear and tear because they're not super exposed. So I think this is starting to look pretty cool, but we're going to need to definitely start to change our color here. So instead what I want to do is go ahead and decrease our saturation entirely so that we're going to be getting this pure white. And now instead of using just a straight copy blending mode, let's go ahead and also switch this to be overlay so that we're not getting this drastic, very vibrant edge wear, but instead we're just kind of brightening up the values and keeping the same hue baseline underneath it so that we can see we're getting some very distinct edges. However, it's not incredibly visible quite yet because this particular mask is actually going to be useful in another output, which we'll take a look at in a second. And now finally, the last thing I want to do for our color is go ahead and again sharpen everything up just a touch here. So let's go and use a sharpen node. And by default, 1 is a little bit too intense, but let's go and actually bring this intensity down to about 0.25. And now taking a look at our PBR validate, we can see that maybe some of the edges from the sharpen are going to cause a little bit of issues, but realistically, a majority of this texture is very green, and it might actually even be hard to see the yellow values just because of how minuscule they are. So this doesn't need to be entirely 100% green, but it is a good idea to keep a majority of your texture within the green range, and just keeping an eye on the values that deviate a little bit to see how dark or how bright they are, as well as how big it actually is on your texture. Now, one final thing about this validate node as well is that it works within different thresholds. So we can see that right now we're operating within a dark range threshold of 30 sRGB, which means that my range is much bigger. If I go ahead and switch this to be the 50 sRGB, we can see now actually the value for this black is a little bit too dark. So depending on the ranges that you'd want to hit, you might have to be a little bit more cognizant of it and just go ahead and brighten this value up. But realistically, for what we're trying to do, I think setting this and leaving it on the 30 sRGB is going to be more than fine. And so our final output that I want to take a look at is going to be our roughness, because this is really an important output. It gives a lot of character to the material, and it's not one we've actually really touched on in the previous materials, but leather is going to be a pretty good material to take a look at fiddling around with our roughness map. So like we've seen before, I've just gone and added a curvature smooth node, and then I've added a levels node. And this is all being drawn from our final height to normal blender node. So let's first take a look at just kind of defining and blocking out the roughness of this guy first. So with the levels node, I'm going to actually invert our input handles here, because remember, a whiter value is going to be rough, but a darker value is going to be shinier or glossier. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense in this context where these inner pieces are going to be super glossy, but the faces themselves are going to be a little bit rougher. At least because I want to make a bit of a glossier leather. So let's go and just invert these values. And then I'll start to kind of bring in our black value here. Maybe bring in the white value as well. And then kind of bias our centerpiece there. And I think that's going to be okay. Let's just bring in our black output so that it's not going to be super shiny. It's going to be a little bit rougher overall. Actually, maybe I'll still go ahead and bring this kind of in like that. And how's that looking? Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And you can figure out something that's going to work for you. But now we don't always have to just use surface-driven information, and instead we can go ahead and incorporate some kind of random grunginess across our material. So to do that, I'm going to start to type in grunge, and you can see we have upwards of 15 different grunges, at least in my version alone, that we can use to create this kind of random organic variation in the roughness. So I'm going to use the grunge map 15. And if we bring this in and take a look, right, it's just a bunch of random noise that maybe could replicate the effects of weathering, because maybe you'd be wearing this jacket, outside in the real world. So let's go ahead and add a blend node onto our levels here so we can add these together. And now we can see, right, it's really making some areas shiny and some areas really rough. And that's because, again, it's not really using any of the information that we had just created, but instead it's just taking this grunge and plopping it in over top. Now there's a couple different ways we could tackle this. We could use only the brighter values in this grunge map, and we could just use this as a roughness. We could use only the darker values in this grunge map and then place that over top to make areas a little bit glossier. We could go ahead and kind of use the darker and the brighter areas to give us both effects over top as well. There's really a whole gamut of ways we could do this, but I find that without intention, it can get a little bit confusing. And oftentimes, because we're working on a roughness map, I generally try and create my glossy areas through the base color values or grayscale values. And then any grunges I'm putting in over top are going to be purely for roughness. So that's going to dictate which blending mode we use, because we're trying to keep the white values and get rid of the darker values, right? So I'm going to use a screen blending mode. So that's gotten rid of any of those dark black values and just kept anything that's kind of a little bit brighter. Now it's still pretty rough over top there. So I'm going to just add a levels node onto this grunge map, and I'm going to bring down this white output here. And actually, let's take a look at our roughness first before I do that, so that it's not going to be as bright. So we can see this is a pretty far cry from what we initially had, but it's going to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit tamer, and we're still going to be able to get those glossier values from our initial base pattern here. And actually now I think I can go ahead, maybe just bring in these darker values a little bit so that we're still getting some pretty glossy leather with some kind of rough patches. So that's looking pretty cool, but again, we're still not going to get some of that surface roughness that we would likely be getting from the color values that we created in our leather wear mask here. So let me just position the light a little bit better. And what we can do is drag out our roughness output, adding another blend node because we're going to have to blend this onto it. Let's go and find that leather mask that we had created. And again, thinking about the values for this, we're going to want to try and keep the white values because white is going to be rough and these edges are considered kind of scuffed up, right? A little bit rougher. And just completely get rid of these areas that are pure black. And again, that's going to be the same blending mode that we had just used for the grunge. So I'll bring this mask down and plug this in over top. And we can see a little bit that the areas that are scuffed up are going to be pretty rough, not pure rough, but definitely rougher. And we're going to want to switch the blending mode just to be screen again. So now we're going to get these kind of rough edges showing up and blending in nicely with our grunge and kind of base map as well. Now this is pretty intense. I think maybe we can go ahead and bring this down to like 0.75 just so that it's not as pure rough. And now that's really going to be it for our roughness. And this is starting to look really cool as a final material. So now we're getting pretty close to being done this material. Well, technically it is done, but let's go and expose a couple parameters to make this more flexible once we get into rendering this. So like I was talking about in a couple videos ago, the first parameter I want to take a look at is going to be our creases here, right? Because we want to be able to increase or decrease the intensity of them depending on the particular surface and the clothing that we're going to create. And now if we recall, the node that I wanted to take a look at exposing is going to be this histogram range, and particularly the range parameter itself. So let's go ahead and click on this and just hit expose. And we can go ahead and call this range, but I want to give it a bit of a more specific name. So we can call this something like crease intensity. And we can go ahead and hit OK. And again, remember, we're not going to be able to access it here because we propagated it up towards the graph itself. And now we can go ahead and take a look and see we're going to get crease intensity. Now let's go and actually give it a proper label such as crease intensity. We can go ahead and leave the default on 0.5 so that we're going to get a bit of creases, and making sure that our minimum is 0, maximum is 1, and we're going to clamp this value. So make sure to set that to true. So let's take a look if this is actually working now. You can see as I bring this down, right, no creases whatsoever. And if I bring this up, we're going to get some pretty apparent creases. And now I'm over here at my final roughness output, and I want to expose a parameter that's going to allow me to change and play around with kind of this grunge texture that we're going to put over top of our roughness, and more specifically, changing kind of the intensity or the opacity over top of our roughness, so that we're going to have pretty much a leather with 0 grunge, and it's all going to be surface driven information, to something that also has just kind of 100% of whatever we've declared as being our grunge output. So for this blend between our two levels nodes here, let's go and expose our opacity. And again, let's give it a new name here. So we can do something like grunge intensity. And coming over to our parameters, we can see we're going to have this grunge intensity. Now, grunge intensity is maybe not the best name for the label, but it's going to be okay for an identifier. And so in this grunge intensity parameter, I'm going to call the actual readable name grunge intensity as well. And I'm also going to clamp the value so that it's going to be from a minimum of 0 to a maximum of 1. And if we take a look at the preview, we might notice that we've got crease intensity, which kind of makes sense, right? Our surface values for creases are going to be more or less. But for something like grunge intensity, it might not be as specific, right? We might think that this is also contributing color values or potentially normal values. And so we don't really know what this parameter is actually targeting. So instead of having to call this roughness grunge intensity or grunge roughness intensity or whatever, instead what we can do is go ahead and actually put this in a group. So if I go ahead and start to type in roughness and hit enter, make sure to not put any white space or accidentally hit spacebar after you've typed in the word, because it's going to take literally whatever you type in as the group name. We can see if I go back to preview, now I have this roughness header. And when I click that and drop down, now we're going to have grunge intensity. And it's going to make a little bit more sense that this grunge intensity is specific to our roughness. So this is another way we can categorize the parameters that we're exposing to make it a little bit more explicit as to what each one of these particular sliders are going to be doing. And finally, the last parameter or group of parameters that I want to expose is going to be in our base color. Because while black leather is cool, what if we want to have blue or red or white, or really the entire color spectrum of different kinds of leathers? Like we had seen with the denim or the knit, we can do that very easily, but we don't have the functionality in this graph quite yet. So to first do this, let's go and give ourselves a little bit more space here. And I'm going to plug an HSL node in between our blend and our sharpen node here. So let's type in HSL. And now if I start to play with the saturation, maybe get a better angle of our leather here, and then play around with the hue, we can see that we're going to get the ability to change this leather to whatever color we want. Now, bearing in mind that we're still maintaining some proper PBR values, again, something that's a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright is also going to cause us issues. So again, we might not want to change the lightness value of this particular node, but for completion's sake, I'm going to include it. I want to go and expose all three of these sliders like I just mentioned. Now, it's a bit of a pain in the butt to have to come in here and then expose and then change the name. So we can actually expose multiple parameters a little bit easier. So if I go and right click on this node and then go and expose parameters, which is Control P hotkey, it's going to bring up this little dialog window. And we can see that all of the parameters in this node are going to be here, and I can just select all or go and actually just, pretty much mix and match whichever ones I want to select. And now these are going to be the identifier names, right? The things that I kept changing every time we exposed a parameter for a different node. So we can go ahead and bulk edit those as well. So under this graph identifier prefix, I'll go ahead and start to type in color underscore. And now we're going to be aware that this is affecting the color. Now, again, this is not essential to any kind of functionality, but rather just good naming conventions so that you know what this is actually doing. As well, I don't want to have to go and give each one of these a particular group individually, and we can actually do that here as well under this graph input group. So I'm going to start to type in color, and I'll just hit enter. And when I do that, and I'll scroll all the way down, we can see it's put each one of these into the color group. Now, it's not giving them a readable label, so we're still going to have to do that by hand, but it's done a lot of the bulk work for us. And now I've gone ahead and just called these hue, saturation, and luminosity, and I've kept them all at the default values that we've just exposed. So I've not gone and changed anything. So if we go and take a look at our preview now, we can see that we have this roughness drop down, and we're also going to have this color drop down, which if we go ahead and again, increase the saturation, play around with the hue, Maybe bring up the lightness a little bit as well. We've got a pretty cool and robust material, which we're going to be able to get a whole whack load of different looks from, all within our render application. And again, using just a handful of sliders so that we don't have to come back in to Substance Designer and make all of this unique. So that's been 3 different materials, all with relatively unique aspects about them and how we could go about tackling them to create flexible materials. The next section, I want to kind of challenge you a little bit to go back into this leather material, and we'll take a look at yet again another great flexibility that's afforded to us by this procedural node-based workflow, which is going to let us build upon this particular material and create an entirely different look without having to create everything from scratch. And then we'll take a look at exposing parameters again so that we don't even have to create an entirely new graph or a new package. We can just send this functionality with this leather material and at the click of a button get completely different looks pretty much for free.